Hello there, and welcome to Rock History. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight, to this quiet corner where ancient stories come alive in the darkness. Whether you're settling in for the evening, looking for something to help you unwind, or simply curious about the hidden lives that move through the great palaces of ancient Egypt, thank you for choosing to spend this time with me. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from, and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. It's always such a joy to see our community of history lovers gathered from every corner of the globe. Now, close your eyes for a moment and imagine the weight of a bronze wine jug in your hands, the cool smoothness of its handle worn by decades of use. Feel the stone floor beneath your feet, polished to a soft gleam by countless servants who walk these corridors before you. Smell the lingering traces of incense mixed with lamp oil, the scent that never quite leaves the inner chambers of power. This is where our story begins tonight, in the palace of Ramesses III, more than 3,000 years ago. But this isn't a story about pharaohs or generals, about gold and glory and the grand sweep of empire. This is a story about someone history never bothered to remember. A servant who poured wine and kept secrets. A man so invisible that he could stand in a room and hear treason spoken aloud. A silent witness to a plot that could topple a dynasty. His name was Kinemon, and for one impossible night, the fate of Egypt rested in his calloused, wine-stained hands. Let the noise of the modern world fade away now as we step back through the centuries, back to a time when gods walked among men, when pharaohs were living deities, and when a single choice made in silence could change the course of history forever. The servants' corridor was always cooler than the main palace halls. Stone floors worn smooth by countless feet, walls painted in faded ochres and blues that had once been vibrant, now dulled by years of torch smoke and desert dust. I preferred it this way, these quiet passages where the grandeur of the pharaoh's palace gave way to practicality, where golden splendor yielded to clay storage jars and linen bundles. Here, in these forgotten spaces, a man could move unseen, unheard, unremarked upon. And that was precisely how I had survived for 23 years in the House of Eternity, serving 3 pharaohs and countless nobles, who never once looked at my face long enough to remember my name is Kinemon, though few have reason to use it. To the palace, I am simply the wine-bearer, or more often, no name at all, just a gesture, a snap of fingers, an expectation that the cup will be filled and the wine poured without delay or error. I am 41 years old, which is ancient for a servant, though I move with the silent efficiency of a much younger man. My father was a wine-bearer before me, and his father before him, stretching back through generations to a time when the pyramid builders still worked the stone that would house their god-kings for eternity. We have always served, always watched, always remained silent. The palace where I serve is the winter residence of Pharaoh Ramesses III, may he live forever, though we are far enough into his reign now that the formal blessing sounds more like habit than hope. 31 years he has sat upon the throne of Horus, longer than many men live at all, and the palace reflects this lengthy occupation. The walls are crowded with his cartouches, his names repeated endlessly in paint and gold leaf. The pillars are carved with scenes of his victories over the sea peoples, those mysterious invaders from across the great waters who threatened Egypt in the early years of his reign. Every surface proclaims his might, his divine right to rule, his eternal power. But in the servants' corridors, where I spend most of my hours, we know the truth that the magnificent walls conceal. The pharaoh is old, growing older by the day. His step has become uncertain. His voice, once commanding as thunder, now sometimes wavers mid-sentence. The great wars are behind him. The treasuries that once overflowed with foreign tribute now require careful management. The priests grow bolder in their demands, the nobles more fractious in their disputes. The palace, for all its golden glory, has the feeling of something past its prime, magnificent still, but fading, like a sunset that blazes brightest just before darkness falls. I noticed it first in small things. The way the chief treasurer would pause too long before answering questions about the royal storehouses. The hushed conversations that would stop abruptly when a servant entered a room. The increasing frequency of private meetings, held not in the grand audience hall, but in smaller chambers, with fewer witnesses. The palace has rhythms, patterns, routines that remain constant for years, and when those patterns shift, a careful observer takes note. Not that I considered myself particularly careful or observant. I was simply doing what I had been trained to do since childhood: remain present but invisible, hear everything but repeat nothing, see all but acknowledge none of it. These are the fundamental laws of palace service, taught to me by my father in the same quiet, methodical way he taught me to mix wine with water in proper proportions, to anticipate when a cup would need refilling, to read the mood of a room from the posture of shoulders and the cadence of voices. The evening that changed everything began like countless others before it. The sun had set beyond the western cliffs, where the royal tombs were cut deep into the living rock, and the palace was settling into its nocturnal rhythms. The public halls were empty now, the day's audiences concluded, the petitioners dismissed, the various priests and officials departed to their own quarters. This was when the real work of the palace continued in smaller, more private spaces. This was when I was most needed. I had been summoned to the chambers of Paynacht, the royal chamberlain, a man of middle years who had risen to prominence through a combination of administrative competence and political discretion. His rooms were located in the northern wing of the palace, away from the Pharaoh's personal quarters, but still within the inner sanctum, where only high officials and trusted servants were permitted. I knew the way without thought, my feet finding the familiar path through corridors lit by oil lamps that created more shadow than light. I carried with me the tools of my trade: a bronze jug containing wine from the royal cellars, cups of painted pottery for the guests who would be present, and a small vessel of water for those who preferred their wine diluted in the old style. The jug was heavy, but I had carried such weight since I was a boy learning my father's profession. My arms no longer felt the burden. Paynacht's door was guarded by a single soldier, unusual for a private meeting but not unprecedented. The guard knew me by sight, if not by name, and nodded me through without question. This was the power of my invisibility. A face so familiar it required no scrutiny, a presence so expected it merited no attention. I entered the chamber and immediately assessed the situation as I had been trained to do. The room was not large, perhaps 20 feet on each side, with walls painted in geometric patterns of red and yellow. A window on the eastern wall was shuttered against the night air. Several oil lamps provided illumination that was somehow both too bright and insufficient, creating pockets of deep shadow in the corners. A low table occupied the center of the room, surrounded by cushions where 4 men sat or reclined in various attitudes of ease or tension. Paynacht himself was easy to identify, occupying the position of honor nearest the window. He was a lean man, with a face that revealed little, trained by years of court service to maintain neutrality of expression regardless of inner thoughts or feelings. Beside him sat 2 men I recognized as junior officials in the royal administration, their names escaping me, but their faces familiar from previous encounters in the palace halls. The 4th man was unknown to me, which was itself significant. I knew most faces that moved through the palace with any regularity, and this man was not among them. He was younger than the others, perhaps 30 years old, with the bearing of someone accustomed to physical activity rather than sedentary administrative work. A military man, I guessed, though he wore no obvious insignia of rank. His skin was darker than the typical palace official, suggesting time spent under the full force of the desert sun rather than in shaded corridors and comfortable offices. His eyes, when they briefly flickered toward me as I entered, were alert and calculating in a way that made me instinctively uncomfortable. I performed my duties with the automatic precision of long practice. I approached the table, knelt beside it in the proper posture of service, and began to pour wine into the cups I had brought. The conversation, which had paused momentarily at my entrance, resumed as though I were not present at all. This was the other half of invisibility, not merely being unnoticed, but being so expected, so much a part of the environment that one's presence was no more remarkable than the furniture or the walls. "The timing must be precise," Paynak was saying, his voice low but clear in the enclosed space. "Any deviation from the plan will result in failure, and failure will mean death for all of us." I continued pouring, my hands steady, my face expressionless, my mind beginning to register that this was not an ordinary administrative meeting about grain allocations or temple offerings. The atmosphere in the room was charged with a tension that had nothing to do with routine palace business. "The Pharaoh's schedule is predictable," the military man said, his voice rougher than the smooth courtly tones of the officials. "Every third day he visits the temple of Ammonius at dawn, before the heat becomes oppressive. He takes the same route, through the eastern gardens, with the same minimal escort. He has done this for years. His habits make him vulnerable." My heart began to beat faster, though my hands remained perfectly steady as I filled the final cup and set the jug down on the table beside the water vessel. I bowed slightly, preparing to withdraw to my customary position against the wall, where I would wait silently in case more wine was required. "The guards can be managed," one of the junior officials said. "I have made arrangements with 3 of the men who will be on duty. They understand what is required of them, and have been promised positions of authority in the new order." New order. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from incense, heavy with implication. I took my position against the wall, becoming as still and silent as possible, barely allowing myself to breathe. My eyes were lowered, as was proper for a servant, but my ears were capturing every word, every nuance, every terrible detail. "And the prince?" Paynak asked. "He is the true danger. If he survives his father, he will hunt us down one by one. His loyalty is absolute, and his capacity for vengeance is well documented. The prince will be attending a festival at Memphis," the second junior official replied. "I have reviewed the travel arrangements myself. He will be 3 days' journey from Thebes when the event occurs. By the time word reaches him, and he returns, we will control the palace, the army, and the succession. He will have no choice but to accept the new pharaoh or face civil war that he cannot win." New pharaoh. The words seemed to echo in this small room, growing louder in my mind even though they had been spoken in normal conversational tones. They were discussing assassination, the murder of a living god, of the man who stood between order and chaos, whose divine authority maintained Mot, the cosmic balance that kept Egypt from descending into the isthmus of disorder and destruction. I had served in the palace through times of plenty and times of scarcity, through military victories and diplomatic setbacks, through festivals of joy and periods of mourning. I had seen nobles rise and fall, had watched political fortunes shift like sand in desert winds, had observed the endless dance of power and favor that defined life in the pharaoh's house. But never, in all my years, had I encountered anything like this. Plots against individual nobles, yes. Schemes to gain advantage or undermine rivals, certainly. But a conspiracy to murder the pharaoh himself, to overturn the divine order, to remake the very structure of Egyptian power? This was something beyond the ordinary corruption and ambition that flourished in any great household. "The weapon?" Paynak asked, his voice dropping even lower, though not so low that my trained ears could not capture every syllable. The military man reached inside his tunic and produced something that he placed on the table. I could not see it clearly from my position, but the others leaned forward to examine it with obvious interest. "A gift from our foreign allies," the military man said with what might have been satisfaction in his voice. a blade of iron, not bronze. It can penetrate armor that would turn aside conventional weapons. Quick, quiet, effective. The Pharaoh will be dead before his guards understand what has happened. And the blame? One of the junior officials asked, a tremor of nervousness entering his voice for the first time. We cannot simply murder the Pharaoh without explanation. The people, the priests, the army, they will demand answers. They will demand justice. The Libyans, Paynak said calmly, as though discussing the weather or the harvest. We will ensure that evidence points to Libyan assassins. The people already fear them after the wars. The priests will accept it, and we will use the crisis to justify the emergency succession of our chosen candidate, who will, naturally, promise swift vengeance against Libya to satisfy the public's thirst for blood. Who is the chosen one? The military man asked. You have spoken of a new pharaoh, but you have not revealed his identity. There was a pause, a moment of silence that seemed to stretch longer than it actually did. I could feel the weight of unspoken knowledge in the room, secrets within secrets, layers of conspiracy that I was only beginning to understand. Prince Pentawere, Paynak finally said, and I felt my blood turn cold at the name. Pentawere, one of the Pharaoh's younger sons, a man known for his ambition and his resentment at being passed over in the succession in favor of his older brother. A man who had been quietly gathering supporters among the palace officials and military commanders, though I had not understood until this moment the true extent of his plotting. A man who was willing to murder his own father to seize the throne that would never be his by legitimate means. Pentawere has agreed to the plan, the second junior official asked, sounding surprised. He understands that his father must die by our hands? He understands necessity, Paynak replied. He understands that Egypt needs young, vigorous leadership, not an aged pharaoh whose glory days are behind him. He understands that he is better suited to rule than his brother, who is a priest at heart, more interested in rituals than in governance. And he understands that fortune favors the bold, that those who seize opportunity rather than wait for it to come to them are the ones who shape history. The military man laughed, a sound without real humor. Pretty words for patricide, but I suppose every revolution requires its justifications. When does this necessity occur? 3 days from now, Paynak said. At dawn, as the pharaoh walks through the eastern gardens to the temple of Ammonius. The timing is ideal. The prince will be with his brother in Memphis, establishing his alibi. The palace will be caught completely unprepared, and we will be ready to step in and restore order under the new pharaoh's authority. 3 days, the military man repeated. Then we have much to prepare. The men must be positioned. The evidence against the Libyans must be planted. The succession documents must be ready. And we must ensure that no whisper of this reaches unfriendly ears. As if on cue, all 4 men turned to look at me. My heart, which had been beating rapidly throughout this entire conversation, seemed to stop entirely. I stood against the wall, my eyes still properly lowered, my posture still that of a dutiful servant waiting for further instructions. But I could feel their gazes on me, assessing, calculating, deciding. The wine-bearer, one of the junior officials said slowly. He has been here the entire time. He is nothing, Paynak said dismissively, though I caught an edge of concern in his voice. I have used him for years. He hears everything and understands nothing. He is like the furniture, present but unaware. Servants of his class are trained from childhood to be invisible, to let words pass through them without comprehension or memory. Are you certain? The military man asked, his voice harder now, with a quality that suggested he preferred permanent solutions to potential problems. I am certain, Paynak said firmly. Kitamon, come here. I moved forward as I had been commanded, my steps measured and calm despite the terror coursing through my veins. I knelt beside the table again, my eyes still down, my face still expressionless. Kinemon, Paynak said, his voice taking on the tone one might use with a slow child or a particularly dim animal. You have been serving wine this evening. Did you hear anything of interest? This was the moment. This was the choice that would define the rest of my life, however long or short that might be. I could tell the truth, could admit that I had heard every word of their treasonous plot, and I would die here in this room, killed by the military man's iron blade before I could draw another breath. Or I could lie, could play the role they expected of me, the invisible servant who exists only to pour wine and has no capacity for understanding or memory beyond the immediate requirements of his service. No, my lord, I said, keeping my voice flat and empty. I heard only that you wished wine. I poured wine. That is all I know. Paynak studied me for a long moment, and I felt the weight of his scrutiny like a physical pressure. The room was silent except for the soft hiss of the oil lamps and my own carefully controlled breathing. You see, Paynak finally said to the others, he is perfect for our purposes precisely because he is so imperfect in every other way. A man with no ambition, no intelligence beyond his narrow duties, no existence beyond his service. He could stand in this room all night and leave with nothing more than the memory of how many cups he filled. I still think we should be cautious, the military man said. Dead men tell no tales, and wine-bearers are easily replaced. And mysterious deaths create questions and attention we cannot afford, Paynak countered. If Kinemon fails to report for duty tomorrow, it will be noticed. There will be inquiries. Someone will remember that he served us tonight. No, he is more useful to us alive and ignorant than dead and suspicious. Besides, he added with what might have been amusement, killing every servant who might overhear something would leave us with no servants at all. The palace would cease to function. The military man seemed unconvinced, but did not press the point further. As you wish. But if there is any indication that he remembers or understands what was discussed here tonight, I will handle the problem personally. Agreed, Paynak said. Kinemon, you may go. Leave the wine. We may require more later. Report to the steward that you have completed your service here and are available for other duties. I bowed low, backed away from the table in the proper manner, and turned to leave the room. Each step toward the door felt like a journey across an impossible distance. I expected at any moment to feel the iron blade pierce my back, to hear the military man decide that caution was, after all, the wisest course. But I reached the door without incident, passed through into the corridor, where the guard still stood at his post, and walked away with measured, unhurried steps. Only when I had turned 2 corners, and was well away from Paynak's chambers did I allow myself to pause, pressing my back against the cool stone wall and taking deep, shuddering breaths. My hands were shaking now, the tremors I had suppressed throughout that terrifying encounter finally finding expression. I looked down at them as though they belonged to someone else, these calloused, wine-stained hands that had held the fate of Egypt for the past half hour. What was I going to do? The question echoed in my mind as I made my way through the darkened corridors toward the servants' quarters. 3 days. I had 3 days to decide whether to remain invisible, to continue playing the role I had perfected over decades, to let history unfold as the conspirators had planned. Or I had 3 days to find a way to warn the Pharaoh, to expose the plot, to prevent the murder of a living god. But who would listen to me? I was nobody, a servant whose name was barely known even to the other servants. I had no access to the Pharaoh himself, no way to request an audience or deliver a message that would be taken seriously. If I approached one of the palace officials with my story, how could I be sure they were not part of the conspiracy? Paynak was the royal chamberlain, a man of immense influence with connections throughout the palace hierarchy. The junior officials who had been in that room held positions in the royal administration. The military man clearly had support among the guards and soldiers. For all I knew, the conspiracy extended throughout the palace, into every corner and every level. And even if I found someone trustworthy to warn, why would they believe me? I had no proof beyond my word, and the word of a wine-bearer counted for nothing against the denials of high officials. They would call me mad, or claim I had misunderstood what I heard, or accuse me of inventing lies to gain attention or advantage. And then, inevitably, word would reach Paynak that the servant he had dismissed as invisible and ignorant had tried to expose the plot. The military man would get his wish, and my body would be found in the river or buried in the desert sand, another unexplained death in a palace where death was always present. I reached the servants' quarters, a series of small rooms off a central courtyard where dozens of palace servants slept on reed mats and stored their few possessions. My own space was barely large enough to lie down in, but it was mine, a tiny island of privacy in the vast sea of the palace. I lay down on my mat and stared up at the ceiling, watching the shadows cast by the single oil lamp I had lit. My father had taught me many things about being a palace servant, but he had never taught me how to handle something like this. His philosophy had been simple: do your duty, stay silent, remain invisible, and you will survive. It had worked for him through a long career serving 2 pharaohs. It had worked for his father before him. It had worked for me for 23 years. But now, continuing to follow that philosophy meant allowing the murder of the pharaoh, the overthrow of the legitimate succession, and the elevation of a patricide to the throne of Horus. Could I live with that? Could I pour wine and serve meals and move silently through the palace corridors knowing that I had heard the plot and done nothing? Could I watch Pharaoh Ramesses walk to his death? Could I see the grief of his legitimate sons? Could I witness the chaos that would follow, all while maintaining my mask of invisible ignorance? But what alternative did I have? I was one man, powerless, voiceless, with no resources and no allies. Even if I wanted to stop the assassination, I had no means to do so. I was not a warrior who could stand against the military man and his corrupted guards. I was not a priest who could invoke the authority of the gods. I was not a noble with the influence to rally supporters or expose conspiracies. I was simply Kinnam the wine-bearer, a man whose greatest skill was being unnoticed. And yet there was something in me, something I had not known was there, that recoiled at the idea of doing nothing. Perhaps it was something my father had planted in me through years of service, a seed of loyalty to the institution we served, if not to the individuals who composed it. Perhaps it was something more personal, a sense that remaining silent in the face of such evil would diminish me in some fundamental way, would make me complicit in the crime even if I wielded no weapon. Or perhaps it was simply that I had spent 41 years being invisible, and some part of me was tired of it, tired of being nothing, tired of having no existence beyond my function. I did not sleep that night. I lay on my mat and watched the oil lamp burn down until it guttered and went out, leaving me in darkness. And in that darkness, I made my decision. I would try. I would try to stop the assassination, even though the odds of success were infinitesimally small, even though the attempt would almost certainly cost me my life. I would try because the alternative was to spend whatever days remained to me knowing that I had let Egypt fall into chaos, had let murderers and traitors triumph, had let my own cowardice masquerade as wisdom. But I would have to be clever. I would have to use the very invisibility that had protected me all these years, turn it into a weapon rather than a shield. I would have to move through the palace as I always had, drawing no attention, raising no suspicions, while quietly working to undermine the conspiracy. The first problem was gathering information. I knew the broad outlines of the plot: assassination in 3 days, during the pharaoh's dawn walk to the temple, framed as a Libyan attack, with Pentawere ready to seize power in the ensuing chaos. But I needed details. I needed to know exactly which guards had been corrupted, where the iron blade was hidden, what evidence against the Libyans was being prepared, who else might be involved in the conspiracy. And I needed to find someone I could trust, someone with the authority to act on the information I could provide, someone who would believe the word of a wine bearer against the denials of powerful officials. The answer, when it came to me in the gray light of dawn, was both obvious and terrifying. There was one person in the palace who would certainly believe me if I could provide convincing evidence, one person who had every reason to want the plot exposed and stopped, one person with the authority to take immediate action. Prince Ramesses, the Pharaoh's eldest son and legitimate heir. The same prince whom the conspirators believed was safely away in Memphis, 3 days' journey from Thebes. But I happened to know something the conspirators did not know, a piece of information I had picked up 3 days earlier while serving wine in the quarters of the palace administrator who managed royal travel arrangements. The prince's trip to Memphis had been delayed by 2 days due to a problem with one of the ceremonial barges that was supposed to transport him and his retinue. The delay had been kept quiet to avoid embarrassment, known only to a few administrators and, apparently, to invisible servants who happened to be present when it was discussed. Prince Ramesses was still here in Thebes, still in the palace. If I could reach him, if I could convince him to listen, if I could provide enough details to make my story credible, then perhaps there was a chance. But approaching a royal prince was not something a wine-bearer could do easily. The prince's quarters were guarded, his movements controlled, his audiences carefully managed. I could not simply knock on his door and request a private conversation. I needed a reason to be in his presence, a service to perform that would put me in the same room with him without arousing suspicion. I spent the morning of that first day moving through the palace, performing my usual duties, pouring wine for officials and nobles, emptying and refilling jugs, maintaining the perfect mask of invisible service. But my mind was working constantly, searching for an opportunity, a gap in the usual patterns that I could exploit. The opportunity came late in the afternoon. I was passing through the administrative wing when I overheard 2 stewards discussing the evening's arrangements. Prince Ramesses, it seemed, had requested a private dinner in his quarters rather than dining in the main hall. A request had been sent to the kitchens for a selection of dishes and, naturally, wine from the royal cellars. The senior wine-bearer who usually served the prince was attending to a banquet for foreign ambassadors and would not be available. I approached the stewards with appropriate deference. "Pardon me, my lords, but I could not help but overhear that wine service is needed for Prince Ramesses this evening. I am available if you require an additional wine-bearer." The stewards barely glanced at me. "Yes, fine, you will do. Report to the prince's quarters at sunset with wine from the royal cellars. The usual selection. Don't embarrass us by making mistakes. As you command, my lords." And just like that, through the mundane mechanics of palace logistics, I had gained access to the one person who could stop the assassination. But access was only the first step. The greater challenge would be finding a way to communicate with the prince privately, to deliver my warning without being overheard by guards or servants who might be part of the conspiracy. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. I selected wine from the cellars with unusual care, choosing varieties that I knew the prince favored. I made sure my appearance was as neat and inconspicuous as possible. And I tried to think through every possible scenario, every way the evening might unfold, every potential obstacle or danger. As sunset approached and the palace began its transition into evening routines, I made my way toward the prince's quarters in the northern section of the palace. My heart was beating faster again, though I forced my breathing to remain steady and my steps to maintain their usual measured pace. To any observer, I was simply another servant performing another routine task. But I carried with me knowledge that could topple kingdoms, and I was walking toward a confrontation that could end either in salvation or death. The prince's quarters were reached through a series of corridors and courtyards, each transition marked by increasing levels of security and luxury. The walls here were painted with elaborate scenes of royal hunts and religious ceremonies. The floors were polished to a mirror shine. The oil lamps were of bronze rather than simple clay, casting a warmer, more even light. I passed 2 sets of guards before reaching the entrance to the prince's private chambers. Both times I was stopped, questioned, and then waved through when they verified that I was expected. The final door was guarded by a single soldier who wore the insignia of the royal bodyguard, the elite unit responsible for protecting the pharaoh and his immediate family. Wine service for Prince Ramesses, I said quietly, holding up the jug and cups I carried. The guard nodded and opened the door, allowing me to enter. The prince is in the main chamber. Serve him and wait for dismissal. I stepped through the door into a space that was both more modest and more luxurious than I had expected. The prince's private chambers were not as vast as the pharaoh's state apartments, but they were furnished with obvious care and taste. Beautiful furniture of ebony and ivory, walls hung with fine linens painted with subtle geometric patterns, tables holding scrolls and writing implements that suggested a man who valued learning and literacy. Prince Ramesses himself was seated at a low table, examining what appeared to be architectural drawings spread before him. He was a man in his early 30s, with the strong features and bearing that marked him as his father's son. Unlike the pharaoh, who was always seen in full regalia and formal court dress, the prince wore simple linen clothing that suggested he was off-duty, relaxing in his private space. He glanced up as I entered, his eyes taking me in with a quick assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating people. Wine bearer. Good. I'm parched, and the day has been longer than I anticipated. Pour me a cup, undiluted. I approached the table, set down the vessels I carried, and began the familiar ritual of pouring wine. The prince returned his attention to the drawings, making occasional marks with a stylus, seemingly absorbed in his work. This was the moment. I was alone with the prince, or as alone as I was likely to be. The guard outside the door could not hear normal conversation inside these thick walls. But how did I begin? How did a wine-bearer address a prince about matters of treason and assassination? I poured the wine with my usual practice movements, set the cup before the prince, and then did something I had never done in 23 years of palace service. I did not step back to wait in silence. Instead, I remained close to the table and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. My lord prince, I must speak with you about a matter of terrible urgency. Your life and your father's life are in immediate danger. The prince's head snapped up, his eyes fixing on me with sudden, intense focus. His hand moved almost imperceptibly toward a dagger that lay on the table near the architectural drawings, a casual placement that I now realized was anything but casual. Explain yourself, quickly and clearly, he said, his voice still normal in volume, but with an edge of command that permitted no evasion or delay. And be aware that if this is some kind of trick or test, it will go very badly for you. It is not a trick, my lord. 3 days from now, at dawn, when your father walks through the eastern gardens to the temple of Ammonius, he will be murdered. The assassination is planned by Royal Chamberlain Paynact and supported by corrupted guards and officials. The plan is to make it appear as a Libyan attack, and in the chaos that follows, Prince Pentawere will seize the throne. The prince's face went very still, showing nothing of what he might be thinking or feeling. When he spoke again, his voice was even quieter than before. That is a serious accusation. How does a wine-bearer come to know of such a conspiracy? I served wine to the conspirators 2 nights ago in Paynac's chambers, my lord. They spoke freely because they believed me to be too ignorant and insignificant to understand or remember what I heard. But I heard everything, every detail of their plan. And why should I believe you? For all I know, you are part of some counterplot designed to make me act rashly and discredit myself, or you are simply mad, or you misunderstood some innocent conversation. I had anticipated this skepticism. My lord, I can tell you details that only the conspirators themselves would know. They plan to use an iron blade, a gift from foreign allies, because it can penetrate armor that would stop bronze weapons. They have corrupted at least 3 guards, who will be on duty during the assassination. They are planting evidence against Libyans to provide a convenient scapegoat. And they believe you are safely in Memphis, 3 days away, unable to intervene. The prince was silent for a long moment, studying me with those intense eyes. I kept my gaze respectfully lowered but felt the weight of his scrutiny like a physical force. You know that if you are lying or mistaken, I will have you executed, he finally said. I know, my lord. But if I am telling the truth and do nothing, the Pharaoh dies, Egypt falls into chaos, and a murderer sits on the throne of Horus. That is worse than my death. Sit, the prince commanded, gesturing to a cushion across the table from him. And tell me everything. Every word you heard, every person who was present, every detail no matter how small. If your story is convincing, I will investigate. If it is not, may the gods have mercy on your Ka, because I will not. I sat on that cushion, acutely aware that I had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The invisible servant had made himself visible, had spoken when he should have remained silent, had inserted himself into the grand currents of history when he should have stayed safely in the shadows. Prince Ramesses leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled before him, and I began to speak. I told him everything. I described Paynak's chamber in detail, the arrangement of the men around the low table, the flickering lamplight that cast their faces in alternating brightness and shadow. I recounted the conversation word for word as best I could remember, from the initial discussion of timing and the Pharaoh's predictable schedule, to the revelation of the iron blade, to the plan to frame the Libyans, to the final shocking disclosure that Prince Pentawere was the intended beneficiary of this patricide. The prince listened without interruption, his face remaining carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when I mentioned his brother's name, the flash of anger in his eyes when I described how casually the conspirators had discussed their father's murder. When I finished, the silence stretched between us like a taut rope, ready to snap at any moment. You have a good memory for someone who is supposed to be too ignorant to understand what he hears, the prince finally said, and I could not tell if this was accusation or observation. My father taught me that a good servant remembers everything, my lord. He said that memory is the foundation of proper service, that anticipating needs requires knowing patterns and preferences. I have spent my life training my memory, though I never imagined I would use it for something like this. Tell me about the military man. You said you did not recognize him. Describe him in detail. I closed my eyes, bringing back the image of that fourth conspirator. Younger than the others, my lord, perhaps 30 years. Dark skin, darker than most palace officials, as though he spends much time in the sun. Lean but muscular, with the bearing of someone accustomed to physical exertion. His hands were scarred, the kind of scars that come from weapons training. He wore no obvious insignia, but the way he moved, the way he held himself, suggested military discipline. And his voice, my lord, it had the roughness of someone more accustomed to shouting commands on a training ground than engaging in quiet palace conspiracies. The prince nodded slowly. That could be Captain Marenta, commander of the Nubian auxiliary forces stationed outside the city. He has been lobbying for increased authority and better provisions for his men. I thought his discontent was the usual military complaint about resources and recognition, but perhaps it runs deeper. And the 2 junior officials? You said you recognized their faces but not their names? Yes, my lord. I have seen them in the administrative wings, usually in the company of more senior officials. They handle routine matters, grain allocations, and tax records and such. They are young enough to still be establishing their careers, which might make them susceptible to promises of advancement under a new pharaoh. Ambitious mediocrities looking for a shortcut to power. The prince said, his voice heavy with contempt. The palace is full of such men. And Paynak, the royal chamberlain himself. That is the detail that makes your story most credible and most troubling. Paynak has served my father for 15 years. He has been trusted with the most sensitive responsibilities, given access to the inner workings of the court, elevated to a position of genuine authority. His betrayal is not just treason against the pharaoh, but a violation of every principle of might, every sacred bond between lord and servant. Yes, my lord. But I think that is why he believes the plot can succeed. He knows the palace routines better than almost anyone. He knows where the vulnerabilities are, when security is lax, which guards can be corrupted, which officials can be manipulated. His very position of trust makes him the perfect conspirator. The prince stood and began to pace the room, his movements tightly controlled despite the obvious agitation in his mind. 3 days, you said. That gives us very little time to counter this plot. And we must be careful, because if the conspirators learn that we know about their plan, they might accelerate the timeline or change their approach. We need to catch them in the act, with evidence so overwhelming that even my brother cannot deny his involvement. My lord, if I may ask, what will you do about Prince Pentawere? He is your brother, your own blood. The prince stopped pacing and turned to look at me, and the expression on his face was terrible in its cold determination. My brother has chosen to become a patricide and a traitor. Whatever affection I once had for him died the moment he agreed to participate in our father's murder. When this is over, he will face justice as any other conspirator would. The fact that we share blood will not save him. And the pharaoh, my lord? Will you warn him? Eventually, yes. But not immediately. If my father knows about the plot, his behavior might change in subtle ways that alert the conspirators. He might increase his security, alter his routines, show suspicion toward Paynak. And the conspirators would scatter, perhaps to try again at some future date when we are less prepared. No, we must let the plot proceed according to their plan, but we will be ready to intercept it at the crucial moment. We will catch them with a weapon in their hands, with their intentions undeniable. That is a dangerous strategy, my lord. What if something goes wrong? What if the conspirators succeed despite your preparations? Then I will have failed my father and my duty, and Egypt will descend into the chaos I was meant to prevent. But I believe the risk is justified. A failed assassination attempt that we stop at the last moment will expose not just this conspiracy but potentially others as well. It will allow us to root out treachery throughout the palace and the military. It will send a message that plots against the divine order will not be tolerated. He returned to the table and sat down again, his eyes fixing on me with renewed intensity. This puts you in a difficult position, wine-bearer. You will need to continue serving Paynak and the other conspirators as though nothing has changed. They must believe that you remain ignorant and invisible. Can you do that? Can you stand in the same room with men who plan murder and maintain the facade of the simple servant? I have spent my entire life maintaining facades, my lord. I can do what is necessary. You understand that if they suspect you have betrayed them, they will kill you without hesitation. The military man, this Captain Marenta, he wanted to eliminate you immediately. Only Paynak's confidence in your ignorance saved you. If that confidence wavers, you are a dead man. I understand, my lord. But I chose to come to you knowing the risks. I am committed to seeing this through, whatever the cost. The prince studied me for another long moment, then nodded slowly. You are either very brave or very foolish, wine-bearer. Possibly both. But you have done Egypt a great service by bringing this plot to my attention, and if we succeed in stopping it, you will be rewarded appropriately. I cannot promise you wealth or title, Those things are beyond my authority to grant to someone of your station, but I can promise you protection and the knowledge that you saved your Pharaoh's life. I seek no reward, my lord, only to prevent a great evil. Noble sentiments. Let us hope they sustain you through the difficult days ahead. Now, here is what we will do. You will return to your usual duties and routines. If you are called to serve Paynak or any of the conspirators again, you will do so as you normally would. You will watch and listen, and if you learn anything new about the plot, any changes to their plans or additional conspirators, you will find a way to inform me. Can you read and write? I can, my lord. My father insisted I learn, though it is unusual for servants. Good. That makes things easier. In the servants' wing, there is a storage room where old linens are kept before being distributed to the launderers. Do you know it? Yes, my lord. There is a loose stone in the floor near the eastern corner, beneath a pile of worn blankets. If you need to leave me a message, write it on papyrus or cloth, place it beneath that stone, and move the blankets so that the eastern corner is more exposed than the western. That will signal to my agent that a message is waiting. Check that location twice each day, at dawn and at dusk, in case I need to send instructions to you. I will, my lord. Meanwhile, I will begin my own preparations. I will quietly alert certain trusted guards and officers to be ready for action 3 days from now. I will position my own men near the eastern gardens without making it obvious that security has been increased. And I will gather evidence about the other conspirators, so that when we move against them, we can sweep up the entire network in one operation. What about Prince Pentawere, my lord? He is in the palace, is he not? Will you confront him? My brother is the most dangerous element of this conspiracy because his claim to the throne, while illegitimate, will have some support among those who see him as more vigorous and decisive than our father. If I confront him now, he might flee or rally his supporters for open conflict. No, Pentawere must also be caught in the act, or at least with evidence so clear that his involvement cannot be denied. I will have him watched, but carefully, so he does not realize he is under surveillance. The prince stood again, and I understood that the audience was ending. I rose as well, preparing to return to my role as the invisible servant. But before I could bow and retreat, the prince spoke again. Kinemon, that is your name, is it not? Yes, my lord. I want you to understand something. What you have done tonight took great courage. Not the courage of warriors who face enemies with weapons drawn, but a different kind of courage, the courage to step forward when remaining hidden would have been safer and easier. That is rare, especially in the palace, where self-preservation usually trumps all other considerations. Whatever happens in the days ahead, know that you have honored your service and your ancestors by choosing to act rather than to remain silent. I felt something strange and unfamiliar rising in my chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It took me a moment to recognize it as pride, an emotion I had not felt in many years, perhaps not since my father had told me I was ready to serve in the palace on my own. Thank you, my lord. I will not fail you or the Pharaoh. See that you don't. Now go, and remember, you are still the invisible wine-bearer who understands nothing. Play that role perfectly, because all of our lives depend on it. I bowed deeply and backed toward the door, returning to the mask of servitude that I had worn for so long. The guard outside nodded as I emerged, taking no special notice of me or the length of time I had spent inside. I walked through the corridors back toward the servants' quarters, my mind racing with everything that had been said and everything that would need to be done. The next 2 days were among the longest of my life. I performed my usual duties with mechanical precision, pouring wine and refilling cups, moving silently through the palace halls, all while listening for any hint that the conspirators knew their plot had been discovered. I checked the storage room where the loose stone was hidden, twice each day as the prince had instructed, but there were no messages waiting for me. I left none for him either, having learned nothing new that would change our understanding of the conspiracy. I saw Paynak several times in passing, and each time my heart raced with the fear that he would look at me differently, that somehow my knowledge would show on my face or in my posture. But he never gave me more than the dismissive glance he had always given, the acknowledgment that a piece of furniture might receive. The invisibility that had always been my protection was serving me well now, hiding the tumultuous thoughts and desperate fears that churned beneath my calm exterior. On the evening of the second day, I was summoned to serve wine at a small gathering in the quarters of one of the senior military commanders. When I arrived, I was surprised and disturbed to see Captain Marenta among the guests, the same military man who had sat in Paynak's chambers and discussed assassination with such casual brutality. He glanced at me when I entered, and for a terrible moment, I thought I saw recognition in his eyes, a flash of memory that connected me to that night. But then his attention moved on, and I realized he was simply cataloging my presence the way one might note the arrival of any servant. I served the wine, and took my position against the wall, listening to the conversation flow around me. It was mostly military talk, discussions of troop movements and supply issues and border patrols. But underneath the mundane details, I detected an undercurrent of tension, as though everyone in the room was aware of something unspoken, some approaching event that could not be directly acknowledged. "The Libyans are growing bolder," one officer said, his voice carrying a note of concern. "There have been reports of raids along the western frontier. Small groups, testing our defenses, probing for weaknesses." "Let them come," Captain Marenta said, his voice hard with confidence or perhaps anticipation. "Egypt has dealt with Libyan threats before, and will do so again. Soon, very soon, there will be changes that allow us to respond to such threats with the vigor they deserve." I felt my blood chill at those words. Changes soon. He was referring to the assassination and the succession of Pentawere, speaking of it obliquely in front of officers who might or might not be part of the conspiracy. It was a test, perhaps, to see who would nod knowingly and who would look confused. The senior commander, the one in whose quarters we were gathered, frowned slightly. "What changes do you refer to, Captain? I am not aware of any major policy shifts under consideration." "Oh, nothing certain," Marenta said, too casually. "Just rumors and speculation. The court is always full of whispers about potential changes in leadership and direction. Surely you have heard them too." "I make it a policy not to listen to court gossip," the commander said stiffly. "My concern is with military readiness, not political speculation." The conversation moved on to other topics, but I had noted the exchange and understood its significance. Captain Marenta was feeling confident enough to hint at the coming coup, to gauge the reactions of his fellow officers, to begin building support for the new regime even before it existed. This was valuable information for Prince Ramesses, evidence that the conspiracy was broader than just the men I had seen in Paynak's chamber. That night, I left my first message beneath the loose stone in the storage room. I tore a strip from an old linen cloth and used charcoal to write a brief account of what I had overheard, the hints about changes and Libyan threats, the way Captain Marenta was testing the loyalty of other officers. Then I moved the worn blankets to expose the eastern corner, the signal that a message was waiting. The next morning, the cloth was gone, and a new message was in its place. Prince Ramesses' handwriting was neat and controlled, very different from the rough scrawl I had produced. "Understood. All preparations are in place. Tomorrow at dawn, stay away from the eastern gardens. Find a reason to be elsewhere when the attempt occurs. After, come immediately to my quarters through the servants' passages. Destroy this message." I crumbled the papyrus into tiny pieces and scattered them in different waste containers throughout the palace, ensuring that no one could reassemble the prince's words. Then I spent the rest of that final day before the assassination attempt trying to maintain my composure and perform my duties as though this were any ordinary day. That night, I did not sleep. I lay on my mat in the servants' quarters, listening to the breathing and snoring of the other servants around me, and wondered what the dawn would bring. Would the prince's preparations be sufficient? Would the assassination attempt be stopped in time, or would we be too late? Would the Pharaoh fall to the iron blade before we could intervene? And what would happen to me afterward? Even if the plot was foiled, I had made enemies of powerful people, men who would not easily forgive the betrayal of their plans, no matter how treasonous those plans had been. I thought about my father, about the lessons he had taught me, about his philosophy of survival through invisibility and silence. He would have been horrified by what I had done, by the risks I had taken, by the way I had inserted myself into matters far above my station. But I thought he might also have understood, might have recognized that some situations demand action rather than passive observation, that sometimes remaining invisible is itself a form of betrayal. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness. I heard the night watch change, heard the distant sounds of the palace settling into its deepest sleep, heard the first stirrings as dawn approached and the palace began to wake. I rose from my mat, washed my face in cold water, and prepared myself for whatever this day would bring. Following Prince Rameses's instructions, I needed to stay away from the eastern gardens where the assassination was supposed to occur. I made my way to the western kitchens, where I knew I could find work that would keep me occupied and provide a legitimate reason for my absence from other parts of the palace. The head cook was always happy to have an extra pair of hands during the morning preparation of the royal meals. "Kitamon," the cook said when she saw me, "you are here early. What brings you to my kitchen?" "I thought I might assist with preparations this morning," I said, keeping my voice casual. "I have no pressing duties elsewhere, and I know this is always a busy time for you." She looked at me with mild surprise. Such initiative was unusual from servants, who typically did only what was specifically required of them, but she shrugged and gestured toward a pile of vegetables. "Very well. Those onions need chopping, and the leeks need cleaning. Make yourself useful." I set to work, grateful for the mundane task that would occupy my hands while my mind raced with thoughts of what was happening elsewhere in the palace. The kitchen was warm and busy, full of servants moving with practiced efficiency, preparing bread and beer and various dishes for the day's meals. The smell of baking bread mixed with a sharper sense of onions and spices, creating an aroma that was comforting in its ordinariness. Time seemed to move differently in the kitchen, measured not by the movement of shadows, but by the completion of tasks. I chopped onions until my eyes watered, cleaned leeks until my fingers were raw from the grit, and all the while I listened for any unusual sounds, any indication that something significant was happening elsewhere in the palace. And then, perhaps an hour after dawn, it came. Not a sound at first, but a sudden change in the atmosphere, a ripple of tension that passed through the palace like a stone dropped in still water. Servants began hurrying past the kitchen doors, their faces tight with concern or fear. One of the kitchen workers returned from delivering bread to the guard house, and reported breathlessly that something had happened in the eastern gardens, that guards were running everywhere, that the Pharaoh himself was in the great hall, very much alive, but surrounded by military protection. "What happened?" the head cook demanded, her face pale with worry. "An assassination attempt," the worker said, his voice shaking. "Someone tried to kill the Pharaoh during his morning walk. But it was stopped. The assassins were captured or killed. They say Prince Rameses was there, that he personally fought off the attackers and saved his father's life." The kitchen erupted in excited chatter, everyone talking at once, speculating about who the assassins were and how they had gotten so close to the Pharaoh, and what would happen now. I remained at my station, continuing to chop vegetables with hands that I forced to remain steady, while my mind worked through the implications of what I had heard. The plot had been stopped. The Pharaoh was alive. Prince Ramesses had been there to intercept the assassination attempt. But I needed more details, needed to know if all the conspirators had been captured, if Paynak and Pentawere had been arrested, if my role in exposing the plot was still secret, or if it had become known. "I should return to my usual duties," I said to the head cook, setting down the knife I had been using. "If there has been an attempt on the Pharaoh's life, they may need additional servants to assist with the increased security arrangements." She nodded absently, her attention focused on the stream of rumors and reports flowing into the kitchen from various sources. I slipped away, moving through the palace corridors toward Prince Ramesses' quarters, using the servants' passages as he had instructed. The palace was in a state of controlled chaos. Guards were everywhere, stopping people and demanding identification, searching rooms and questioning anyone who seemed suspicious. But the servants' passages were less heavily monitored. These narrow corridors and hidden staircases that threaded through the palace walls, like arteries, known primarily to those who served rather than those who ruled. I reached the entrance to Prince Ramesses' quarters through a service door that opened into a small antechamber used for storage. From there, I could hear voices raised in what sounded like heated discussion. I hesitated, uncertain whether I should interrupt or wait to be summoned. The decision was made for me when the door opened and a guard I did not recognize gestured for me to enter. "The prince is expecting you, wine." Insignia of their sacred duty. They stepped aside at Prince Ramesses' approach, and we entered a chamber that was relatively modest by palace standards, but still breathtaking in its beauty. The walls were painted with scenes of the pharaoh offering to the gods, the ceiling was decorated with stars and birds, and the floor was covered with fine rugs woven in intricate patterns. And there, seated on a chair that was grand enough to be called a throne, but simple enough to be merely furniture, was Ramesses III, the living Horus, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, the man whose life I had saved. He was older than I had realized, seeing him now at close range rather than at the distance that had always separated us before. His face was lined with age and care, his shoulders slightly stooped despite the regal posture he maintained. But his eyes, when they fixed on me, were sharp and penetrating, the eyes of a man who had ruled for 3 decades and was not easily fooled or impressed. "You are Kinnamon the wine-bearer," he said, and his voice still carried authority even if it no longer had the thunder it had possessed in his youth. I prostrated myself on the floor, pressing my forehead to the cool stone, overcome by the reality of being in the pharaoh's presence, of being addressed directly by the living embodiment of the gods on earth. "Rise, Kinnamon. I would see the face of the man who saved my life." I rose to my knees, keeping my eyes lowered, still not quite believing that this was happening, that I was here, that the pharaoh knew my name. "My son tells me that you overheard a conspiracy against my life and brought this information to him at great personal risk. Is this true?" "Yes, Divine One. I served wine to the conspirators and heard them planning your assassination. I could not remain silent knowing what they intended. Most men would have remained silent. The safest course, after all, is to hear nothing, see nothing, know nothing. Why did you choose differently?" I struggled to find words adequate to explain the decision that had seemed both impossible and inevitable. "Because, Divine One, some silences are themselves a form of betrayal. I have spent my life being invisible, being nothing, and I could accept that as long as my invisibility served a purpose. But to stand by while my pharaoh was murdered, to let my silence enable such a crime, that would have made me complicit in evil. I would have become less than nothing, a void where a man should have been." The pharaoh was silent for a long moment, and I wondered if I had said too much, if my attempt at explanation had veered into presumption. But when he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful rather than angry. "You speak of invisibility and nothingness, and yet what you did required a kind of courage that many nobles and warriors lack. The courage to act when action will bring danger rather than glory, to speak when speech will be doubted rather than praised, to risk everything for principle rather than profit. That is not the behavior of nothing, Kinemon. That is the behavior of a man who understands Mot, who has internalized the cosmic order and balance that sustains Egypt. He paused, then continued. I have been Pharaoh for 31 years. I have known thousands of people, from the highest nobles to the lowest servants. I have seen courage on battlefields and cowardice in throne rooms. I have seen loyalty and betrayal, wisdom and folly, good and evil in all their forms. But rarely, very rarely, have I encountered someone who so perfectly embodies the principle of doing right simply because it is right, with no expectation of reward or recognition. You are a remarkable man, Kinemon, and Egypt is fortunate to have you among her servants. I did not know what to say to such praise from such a source. My throat felt tight, my eyes stung with tears I did not dare shed in the Pharaoh's presence. I managed only a whispered, "Thank you, Divine One. I am honored beyond measure. The question now is what to do with you," Prince Ramesses said, entering the conversation. "Your role in exposing this conspiracy cannot remain completely secret. The conspirators who have been arrested and questioned know that information was leaked. They may not know who leaked it, but eventually someone will determine that you were present in Paynak's chambers that night. Your life is in danger as long as any supporters of the conspiracy remain at large." "Your son speaks truly," the Pharaoh said. "We cannot simply return you to your former position and hope that no one seeks vengeance. But neither can we suddenly elevate you to high office, which would only draw more attention and create new dangers. We must find a solution that protects you while respecting the careful balance of palace life and Egyptian society. I require no elevation, Divine One. I am content with my station. I only ask that I might continue to serve in whatever capacity you deem appropriate." "That is modestly spoken, but not realistic," the Pharaoh said. "You have proven yourself capable of far more than pouring wine. It would be a waste of your abilities to return you to such limited duties. No, I think we must find you a new role, one that utilizes your skills of observation and discretion, one that keeps you close enough to be protected but not so prominent as to make you a target." Prince Ramesses stepped forward. "Father, if I may suggest, Kinemon could serve as a special agent of sorts, reporting directly to me on matters of palace security and potential threats. He has demonstrated an ability to move through the palace unnoticed, to hear and see things that others miss. We need such capabilities, especially now that we have learned how deeply conspiracy can penetrate even the highest levels of our administration." The Pharaoh considered this, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on the arm of his chair. "A spy, you mean? An agent who uses his invisibility as a tool rather than simply as protection." "Not exactly a spy, Father. More of a watcher, someone who helps us identify potential problems before they become actual threats. Someone who can move in circles where obvious guards or officials would be noticed and avoided." "It is a reasonable suggestion. Kinemon, what say you? Would you be willing to continue using your gift for invisibility in service to Egypt, but this time deliberately, and with full knowledge of what you are doing?" I thought about what was being offered. It was not elevation in the traditional sense, no noble title or public recognition. But it was a kind of acknowledgement, a recognition that my skills had value, that I could serve Egypt in ways beyond the routine duties I had performed for so many years. It was also dangerous, potentially more dangerous than simply returning to my former invisibility. But I had already crossed the threshold into danger when I went to Prince Ramesses 3 days ago. There was no going back to the comfortable obscurity I had once known. I would be honored to serve in whatever capacity you command, Divine One. If my ability to move unseen and hear unspoken things can help protect Egypt and its pharaoh, then I will gladly continue to use these skills." "Then it is decided," the Pharaoh said. "You will officially remain a wine bearer, maintaining the cover and those duties. But you will also report to my son on matters of security and potential threats. You will be given access to areas of the palace that would normally be closed to someone of your station, but you will use that access carefully and discreetly. And you will be protected, both by guards, who will be instructed to watch for threats against you, and by the simple fact that very few people will know your true role. There is one more thing," Prince Ramesses added. "Your living quarters are too exposed, too easily accessed by those who might wish you harm. We will move you to a chamber in the palace's secure wing, disguised as additional storage, but actually a comfortable enough space for you to live in relative safety." "You are generous, my lord. I am grateful for such protections." "It is not generosity but necessity," the prince said. "You are valuable to us now, Kinemon. We must keep you alive so that you can continue to serve." The Pharaoh rose from his chair, and I immediately prostrated myself again as protocol demanded. "Rise, Kinemon, and look upon me one more time before you go. I want you to remember this day, to remember that even a wine bearer can change the course of history, that invisibility is not the same as powerlessness, that one man's courage can save a kingdom. Go now with my blessing and my gratitude. May the gods protect you as you have protected me." I backed away from the royal presence, bowing repeatedly, my heart so full of emotion that I could barely breathe. When I reached the doors, I turned and followed Prince Ramesses out of the chamber, leaving the Pharaoh to the endless duties and responsibilities that came with being a living god. In the corridor outside, the prince placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of familiar affection that would have been unthinkable just a few days ago. "You did well in there, Kinemon. You have proven that you are more than just a wine bearer. You are a guardian of Mot, a protector of Egypt. I only hope I can continue to serve with the same success, my lord." "You will. I have faith in that. But for now, you should rest. The past few days have been exhausting for all of us, and you have borne a burden that few men could have carried. Go to your new quarters. I will have someone show you the way." "And Kinemon?" "Yes, my lord." "Thank you. Egypt owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid, but I personally owe you my father's life. That is something I will never forget." A guard appeared and gestured for me to follow. We walked through more corridors, these ones narrower. "Dead or imprisoned. And I have been given responsibilities that I may not be adequate to fulfill. Sometimes survival through invisibility is preferable to prominence through action. But you would do it again, wouldn't you? If you faced the same choice, you would still choose to speak?" I considered the question seriously. Would I? Knowing now what it had cost, what it had gained, what it might still demand of me in the future? "Yes," I finally said. "I would choose the same way. Not because I am brave or noble, but because I discovered that I could not live with myself if I chose differently. We all have limits to how much compromise our souls can endure, and I found mine that night in Paynak's chambers." Kenny nodded slowly, absorbing this. "I hope I would have your courage if I ever face such a choice. I hope you never have to face such a choice. But if you do, trust yourself. Trust the voice inside that tells you what is right, even when everything else argues for caution and self-preservation." The young servant stood, remembering his duties. "I should go, sir. But thank you for speaking with me, and for treating me as an equal rather than as just another servant beneath your notice. We are all servants here, Kenty. Some of us just serve in different ways. Go with the God's blessing." After he left, I ate the meal that had been brought, simple but well-prepared food that reminded me I had barely eaten in the past 3 days. As I ate, I thought about what lay ahead. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but the underlying problems that had enabled the conspiracy remained. A pharaoh growing old, a succession that might be contested, ambitious men seeking power, a palace full of secrets and schemes. My new role would require me to navigate these treacherous waters with even greater care than before. I would need to continue moving through the palace, watching and listening, but now with purpose rather than simply out of habit. I would need to identify potential threats before they materialized into actual plots. I would need to distinguish between ordinary palace intrigue and genuine dangers to the divine order. And I would need to do all of this while maintaining my cover as a simple wine bearer, because the moment people knew my true role, my effectiveness would end. The conspirators had spoken freely in front of me because they believed me to be invisible and ignorant. If future conspirators knew I was watching and listening with intent, they would guard their words and hide their actions. It was a paradox I would have to master, being simultaneously invisible and vigilant, present but unnoticed, hearing everything while appearing to understand nothing. The next several days passed in a strange combination of routine and transformation. I returned to my duties as a wine bearer, moving through the palace as I always had, serving at banquets and private meetings, filling cups and emptying jugs. To the casual observer, nothing had changed. I was still the same unremarkable servant I had always been. But everything had changed. I now watched and listened with conscious purpose. I noted which officials met privately, and what their body language suggested about their relationships. I paid attention to who seemed troubled or anxious, who was spending beyond their apparent means, who was building alliances or nursing grudges. I observed the patterns of palace life not just as background to my service, but as data to be analyzed and understood. And twice each day, I checked the hidden location in the storage room, the loose stone where messages could be left. Sometimes there were instructions from Prince Ramesses, asking me to pay particular attention to certain officials or to serve at specific gatherings where he suspected interesting conversations might occur. Other times I left my own reports, brief summaries of anything I had observed that seemed potentially significant. The aftermath of the conspiracy continued to unfold. More arrests were made as the investigation expanded, revealing a web of corruption and betrayal that went deeper than anyone had initially suspected. Junior officials, who had been promised advancement under Pentuer's regime, were exposed and punished. Guards who had been willing to look the other way during the assassination attempt were dismissed from service, or worse. Merchants who had provided funds for the conspiracy had their goods confiscated and their trading rights revoked. The trials were public spectacles designed to demonstrate that justice was being served and that treachery against the divine order would not be tolerated. I did not attend these trials, having no desire to see the men I had helped expose in their final degradation. But I heard the reports that spread through the palace, the descriptions of how Paynak had maintained his dignity to the end, refusing to beg for mercy but also refusing to show remorse for his actions. He had believed he was acting in Egypt's best interests, he claimed, trying to prevent the kingdom from declining further under an aged pharaoh. His execution was swift and final, a message to anyone else who might harbor similar ambitions. The junior officials broke under questioning, revealing details of the conspiracy and implicating others who had been peripherally involved. Their deaths were less dignified, their cowardice in the face of judgment contrasting sharply with Paynak's stoic acceptance of his fate. Captain Marenta, already dead from the fight in the Eastern Gardens, was subjected to posthumous dishonor. His name was struck from the military rolls. His family was stripped of any benefits they might have received from his service, and his body was denied the proper burial rites that would have ensured his passage to the afterlife. In the Egyptian understanding of death and eternity, this was perhaps the most terrible punishment of all, condemning him to wander as a restless spirit for all time. And Prince Pentuer, though dead by his own hand, was not spared judgment. His name was removed from the royal records, his images were defaced, and his tomb in the royal necropolis was sealed and forbidden, marked as the resting place of a traitor rather than a prince. It was as though he had never existed, erased from history just as thoroughly as any enemy of Egypt might be. The pharaoh himself seemed to age visibly in the weeks following the assassination attempt. The knowledge that his own son had plotted his death, that men he had trusted had betrayed him so completely, had shaken him in ways that military defeats or political setbacks never had. He became more withdrawn, spending more time in private prayer and consultation with priests, less time in the public ceremonies and administrative duties that had filled his days for 3 decades. Prince Ramesses effectively became the acting ruler of Egypt during this period, managing the day-to-day governance, while his father struggled with the emotional and spiritual wounds of the conspiracy. This transition of power was not announced or formalized, but it became clear to everyone in the palace that the prince was making decisions and issuing orders with his father's implicit authorization. I watched this transition with mixed feelings. On one hand, Prince Ramesses was capable and determined, exactly the kind of strong leadership Egypt needed in this moment of crisis. On the other hand, the very fact that such a transition was necessary was evidence of the pharaoh's declining vitality, and it raised questions about what would happen when the old king finally died and the succession became official. There were still supporters of Pentuer's memory, people who believed quietly that he would have been a better pharaoh than his brother, that his ambition and decisiveness were what Egypt needed rather than Ramesses's priestly temperament and methodical administration. These supporters did not speak openly, not after seeing what had happened to the conspirators, but their presence could be felt in subtle ways. A certain coolness when the prince's name was mentioned, a slight hesitation in carrying out his orders, a tendency to praise the old pharaoh's past glories rather than acknowledge the prince's current competence. This undercurrent of dissent was exactly the kind of thing my new role required me to identify and report. I began keeping careful notes of who seemed less than enthusiastic about the prince's growing authority, who might harbor resentment that could eventually ripen into active opposition. These notes I passed to Prince Ramesses through our hidden communication system, and I knew he was using this information to gradually reshape the palace administration, moving potential troublemakers to less sensitive positions, promoting those whose loyalty was unquestionable. It was in this period, about 2 months after the failed assassination, that I had my first real test in my new role. I was serving wine at a gathering of military officers, a routine meeting to discuss supply issues and training schedules for the garrison forces. The conversation was mundane, the kind of administrative detail that keeps any large organization functioning but holds no particular interest or significance. But I noticed something odd. One of the officers present, a man named Amenemhab, who commanded a unit stationed near the Libyan frontier, seemed distracted and tense. He drank more wine than was typical for such meetings, refilling his cup repeatedly in a way that suggested he was trying to calm his nerves or build his courage for something. And several times I saw his eyes flicker toward another officer, a man named Simon who oversaw logistics for the northern garrisons. These glances were brief, easily missed if one were not watching carefully. But there was something in them, some unspoken communication or shared understanding, that made my instincts prickle with the warning that I had learned to trust. As the meeting wore on, I made sure to remain close to these 2 officers, refilling their cups perhaps more often than strictly necessary, creating excuses to linger near them. And my patience was rewarded near the end of the evening when, as the other officers were departing, Amenemhab leaned close to Simon and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow night, then. The warehouse near the eastern docks. We need to discuss the shipment before it moves north." Simon nodded almost imperceptibly and moved away without responding verbally. The exchange had taken perhaps 3 seconds, easily overlooked among the general bustle of people preparing to leave. But I had heard it, and my trained memory had captured every word. What shipment? What warehouse? And why did a discussion about supplies require such secrecy? Military logistics were not usually matters requiring clandestine meetings. The routine flow of weapons, food, and equipment to the garrisons was managed through official channels, with proper documentation and oversight. That night, I left a detailed message beneath a loose stone, describing what I had observed and overheard. The next morning, there was a response from Prince Ramesses. Watch them both carefully. Do not intervene directly. I will have other agents investigate the warehouse. Report anything else you learn. The following day, I made it my business to serve wine at a small gathering that included Simon, though Amenemhab was not present, having presumably returned to his frontier posting. I learned nothing directly suspicious from the conversation, but I noticed that Simon seemed more relaxed than he had the previous evening, as though some burden or worry had been lifted from his shoulders. 2 days later, Prince Ramesses summoned me to his quarters for a private briefing. I arrived through the servants' entrance, as had become my custom, and found him waiting with several documents spread on the table before him. Your instincts were correct, he said without preamble. The warehouse meeting was real, and our agents observed it. Amenemhab and Simon were discussing the diversion of military supplies, weapons and armor primarily, that were supposed to be shipped to the northern garrisons, but were instead being rerouted for sale to Libyan tribes. I felt a chill at these words. They were arming Egypt's enemies. Not quite so dramatic as that. They were engaging in corruption, selling excess supplies for personal profit. The Libyans would have gotten the weapons eventually, but not as part of any coordinated plot against Egypt. This was simple greed, not treason. But still a serious crime, my lord, especially for military officers entrusted with the defense of Egypt's borders. Indeed, and it speaks to a larger problem of corruption within the military administration that we will need to address systematically. But the immediate concern is dealt with. Both officers are now in custody, and we are tracing the full extent of their operation. It appears they have been doing this for at least 2 years, maybe longer. They have grown wealthy at Egypt's expense. How did you want to proceed with them, my lord? They will be tried and punished according to military law. Their wealth will be confiscated, their families will bear the shame of their crimes, and they themselves will face execution or hard labor in the desert mines, depending on how forthcoming they are about other corrupt officials in their network. The prince paused, then looked at me with an expression of satisfaction. This is exactly the kind of threat you were meant to identify, Kinemon. Not grand conspiracies to topple pharaohs, but the more common corruption that weakens Egypt from within. The small betrayals that accumulate over time until the entire structure is compromised. You saw something that others missed, trusted your instincts, and reported it. Because of your vigilance, we have stopped a flow of weapons to potential enemies and identified a network of corruption that can now be dismantled. I am gratified that my service was useful, my lord. More than useful. Essential. And this is just the beginning. As you become more experienced in this role, as you learn to distinguish between innocent oddities and genuine threats, you will become even more valuable. The palace needs eyes and ears that can see and hear what others miss. You are proving to be exactly that. Over the months that followed, I settled into my dual existence. By day, I was Kinemon the wine-bearer, a familiar figure moving through the palace with cups and jugs, present but unnoticed. By night, I was something else, an agent of the prince, a guardian of Egypt's security, a man who watched and listened and reported on the hidden currents that flowed beneath the palace's magnificent surface. I identified 3 more instances of corruption in the first year alone, each one less dramatic than the weapons smuggling but still significant. A treasury official who was falsifying records to skim gold from the tax revenues. A priest at one of the major temples who was selling positions in the priesthood to the highest bidders rather than selecting candidates based on merit and piety. a palace administrator who was accepting bribes to alter the duty rosters of guards, allowing certain areas to be less heavily monitored at specific times. In each case, I observed, gathered evidence, and reported to Prince Ramesses. And in each case, the prince acted swiftly to correct the problem, removing corrupt officials, tightening oversight, and sending messages throughout the palace that dishonesty would not be tolerated. But I also learned that not everything suspicious was actually dangerous. The palace was full of minor intrigues and petty schemes that, while perhaps not admirable, did not rise to the level requiring intervention. Affairs between nobles, small instances of favoritism in appointments, minor violations of protocol and etiquette, these were the normal features of any large household, and trying to eliminate them all would have been both impossible and counterproductive. Learning to distinguish between significant threats and mere background noise was perhaps the most important skill I developed during this period. I could not report everything, or Prince Ramesses would be overwhelmed with trivial information and unable to focus on genuine problems. I had to judge what mattered and what did not, a responsibility that weighed heavily on me because a wrong judgment could allow a real threat to go undetected. The pharaoh's health continued to decline slowly over this period. He was still alive, still technically ruling, but everyone in the palace understood that Prince Ramesses was effectively the power behind the throne. The old king spent most of his time in religious observances, consulting with priests about the proper preparations for his eventual death and journey to the afterlife. He seemed to have accepted that his time was coming to an end, that the gods were calling him to join his ancestors in the eternal fields of the blessed. One afternoon, nearly a year after I had exposed the assassination plot, I was summoned to the pharaoh's private chambers to serve wine during a meeting with the high priest of Ammonius. I had not seen the old king in several months, and I was shocked by the change in his appearance. He had lost considerable weight, his skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his movements were slow and painful, as though every gesture cost him significant effort. But his mind was still sharp, and his voice, though weaker than before, still carried authority as he discussed with the high priest the arrangements for the Jubilee festival that would mark the 32nd year of his reign. It was to be a grand celebration, perhaps the last great public event of his life, a demonstration to all of Egypt that the divine order remained intact despite the recent troubles. As I poured wine for the pharaoh and his guest, I felt a profound sadness. This man who had ruled Egypt for more than 3 decades, who had defended the kingdom against foreign invaders, who had built great temples and monuments, who had been worshipped as a living god, was now clearly approaching his end. The assassination plot that I had helped stop had given him additional months or perhaps a year or 2 of life, but it had not changed the fundamental reality that age and mortality would eventually claim even a pharaoh. After the high priest departed, the pharaoh gestured for me to remain. I stood quietly, waiting to learn what he wanted. "Kitamon," he said, his voice soft but clear. "Come closer. My eyes are not what they once were, and I would see you properly." I approached and knelt before him, keeping my gaze respectfully lowered. "Look at me, Kitamon. I have told you before that I wish to see your face." I raised my eyes and looked directly at the pharaoh, something I had done only once before, on the day after the assassination attempt had been stopped. "Do you know how much longer I have?" he asked, and the question was so direct and unexpected that I was momentarily at a loss for words. "I am not a physician, Divine One. I could not presume to. I am not asking for a medical opinion. I am asking for your observation. You watch people, you notice things that others miss. You have seen me at intervals over the past year. In your judgment, based simply on what you have observed, how much longer does this body have?" I hesitated, uncertain whether honesty or reassurance was what he sought. But he had asked for observation, and I had learned to trust my observations. "Not long, Divine One. Perhaps months. Perhaps a year if the gods are generous, but not much beyond that." He nodded slowly, as though I had confirmed what he already knew. "That is what I thought as well. The physicians give me platitudes and false hope, but I can feel the life ebbing from this body. The cog grows restless, eager to depart for the afterlife, and the BA struggles to remain anchored to this failing flesh. Your son is prepared to assume the throne when the time comes, Divine One. Egypt will be in capable hands. Yes, Ramesses will make a good pharaoh. Better than I feared when he was younger, more interested in temples than in governance. But the assassination plot and the betrayal by Pentawere have hardened him, matured him in ways that peacetime never would have. He understands now the darker aspects of power, the constant vigilance required, the willingness to act decisively against threats. You helped teach him that lesson, Kinemon, by bringing the conspiracy to his attention. I only did my duty, Divine One." Duty. The Pharaoh savored the word. Such a simple concept, yet so few truly understand it. Duty is not about glory or advancement or even survival. It is about doing what must be done because it must be done, regardless of personal cost. You understand that, and it makes you valuable beyond measure." He paused, breathing heavily, and I could see the effort it cost him to speak at length. "I want you to promise me something, Kinemon. When I am gone, when my son sits upon the throne of Horus, continue to serve him as you have served me. Watch over Egypt with those careful eyes. Listen with those attentive ears. Be the invisible guardian that keeps the darkness at bay. Will you promise me this?" "I promise, Divine One. I will serve Prince Ramesses, and through him I will serve Egypt for as long as I am able." "Good. That brings me comfort. And now there is one more thing. When I die, when my body is prepared for the eternal journey, I want you to be part of the funeral procession. Not as a wine bearer, but as yourself, as Kinemon who saved the Pharaoh's life. My son will make the arrangements. It is important to me that you are there, that your presence testifies to the loyalty and courage that still exists in Egypt, even in these troubled times. Divine One, I am honored beyond words, but surely such a prominent role in the royal funeral is exactly what you deserve. I have given this much thought, Kinemon. You have lived your entire life in the shadows, unnoticed and unrecognized. But when I pass into the afterlife, I want the truth acknowledged, at least once, at least in the context of my final journey. You will walk in the procession, and those who know will understand that you represent all the unnamed, unsung servants who keep Egypt functioning through their quiet dedication." I felt tears forming in my eyes, and this time I did not try to hide them. "Thank you, Divine One. I will honor your memory and your trust. I know you will. Now go, and let an old man rest. The conversation has tired me more than I expected. But I am grateful for this time together, for the chance to thank you once more for the gift of additional life that you gave me." I backed away from the royal presence, bowing deeply, and left the chamber with a heavy heart. The Pharaoh's words had affected me profoundly, not just the gratitude he had expressed, but the acknowledgement of what my life had been, and what it had meant to live in perpetual invisibility. 7 months later, Pharaoh Ramesses III died peacefully in his sleep. He had lived long enough to see his Jubilee festival, long enough to complete the preparations for his tomb and his eternal journey, long enough to ensure that the succession would be smooth and uncontested. When the end came, it was not sudden or traumatic, but a gentle fading, the natural conclusion of a long and eventful life. The palace erupted into formal mourning. The professional mourners were summoned to wail and tear their garments, the priests began the elaborate rituals required for a royal death, and the embalmers prepared to begin the 70-day process of mummification that would transform the pharaoh's mortal remains into an eternal body suitable for the afterlife. Prince Ramesses, now Pharaoh Ramesses IV, assumed the throne with a combination of grief for his father and determination to prove worthy of the legacy he had inherited. One of his first acts as Pharaoh was to summon me to his presence, now transformed from the private chambers I had known to the state apartments that befitted the living Horus. My father made me promise that you would be part of his funeral procession. The new Pharaoh said without preamble, not as a servant, but as an honored participant. Are you willing to do this? Of course, Divine One. I promised your father I would. Good. Understand that this will end your effectiveness as an invisible observer. Once you walk in the royal funeral procession in a position of honor, everyone will know that you are more than just a wine bearer. Your true role will become, if not public knowledge, at least widely suspected. I understand, Divine One. But your father's last request outweighs any practical concerns about my future usefulness. That is what I thought you would say. And truth be told, you have served in your covert role for over a year now, longer than I initially expected anyone could maintain such a deception. Perhaps it is time for a change anyway. Perhaps Egypt needs to know that there are still people willing to stand up for what is right, even at great personal risk. The funeral of Ramesses III was one of the most elaborate ceremonies Egypt had seen in many years. The entire kingdom participated in mourning for the pharaoh who had ruled for more than 3 decades, who had defended Egypt against the sea peoples, who had built great temples and maintained the divine order through troubling times. The funeral procession stretched for miles, winding from the royal palace to the Valley of the Kings on the west bank of the Nile, where the pharaoh's tomb awaited its eternal occupant. At the front of the procession were the priests of Ammonius, carrying the sacred standards and chanting hymns for the dead. Behind them came representatives of every temple in Egypt, every god and goddess sending their servants to honor the departed pharaoh. Then came the royal family, led by the new pharaoh Ramesses IV, followed by his brothers, his mother, and other relatives. They wore the formal regalia of mourning, their grief both genuine and ritualized, their presence testifying to the continuation of the royal line despite the loss of its head. And after the royal family, in a position that caused much speculation and whispered comment among the observers, came a simple man in clean white linen, walking with dignity but without pretense. Me, Kinnamon the wine-bearer, who had saved the old pharaoh's life and had been honored for it at his death. I walked through the streets of Thebes, aware of the thousands of eyes watching the procession, knowing that my presence there would generate questions and rumors that would spread throughout Egypt. Who was this man? Why was he given such honor? What had he done to deserve a place in the royal funeral procession? Some would learn the truth, that I had exposed the assassination plot and saved the pharaoh from his enemies. Others would invent their own explanations, weaving stories that might or might not bear any resemblance to reality. But the truth would become part of palace lore, passed down through generations of servants and officials, a reminder that even the invisible can change history. The procession reached the Valley of the Kings, that sacred necropolis where the pharaohs of Egypt were laid to rest in tombs cut deep into the living rock. We descended into Ramesses III's tomb, following the painted corridors that depicted his journey through the underworld, past scenes of the gods judging the dead and the monsters that threatened unwary souls. In the burial chamber, surrounded by all the treasures and provisions the pharaoh would need for eternity, the priests performed the final rites. The opening of the mouth ceremony was conducted, magically awakening the mummy's senses so that the pharaoh could see, hear, eat, and breathe in the afterlife. Offerings were presented, prayers were recited, and the great stone sarcophagus was sealed, enclosing the pharaoh in his eternal rest. And through it all, I stood among the mourners, a living witness to the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. After the funeral, life in the palace gradually returned to a new normal under the rule of Ramesses IV. The new pharaoh proved to be an effective ruler, combining his father's administrative competence with his own more dynamic approach to governance. He strengthened the military, reformed the bureaucracy, and worked to root out the corruption that had flourished during his father's declining years. And I continued to serve, though my role evolved as the new Pharaoh had predicted. I was no longer truly invisible, no longer able to move through the palace unnoticed and unremarked. Too many people knew now that I was more than just a wine bearer, that I had the Pharaoh's confidence and trust. But I adapted as I had always adapted. I trained other servants to watch and listen, creating a network of observers who could go places and hear things that I no longer could. I advised the Pharaoh on security matters, using my years of experience to help him identify potential threats before they matured into actual dangers. And I continued to pour wine, because that was still my foundation, my identity, the skill that connected me to my father and grandfather and all the generations of servants who had come before me. Years passed. Ramesses IV ruled for 6 years before his own death, followed by his son Ramesses V. The dynasty continued, though the kingdom faced increasing challenges from foreign powers and internal economic pressures. The great age of Egyptian empire was slowly fading, though none of us fully understood that at the time. I grew older, my hair turning white, my movements becoming slower and more deliberate. The young servants, who had once seen me as just another face in the palace, now treated me with a respect that sometimes made me uncomfortable. They called me the Silent Guardian, a title I never claimed but could not entirely reject. And sometimes, late at night in my private chamber, I would think back to that evening in Paynak's quarters, when I had stood against the wall and heard men plotting murder. I would remember the moment of choice, the decision to speak rather than remain silent, and I would wonder at how one evening, one choice, one act of courage had transformed my entire existence. Had it been worth it? The fear, the danger, the loss of the comfortable invisibility that had protected me for so many years? I believe it was. Not because of the rewards or recognition, though those had their value, but because I had discovered something about myself that night, something I had not known was there. I had discovered that I am more than just my function, more than just the role I had been assigned at birth. I am a person who could make choices, who could act on principle, who could change history even from the lowest rung of society's ladder. That discovery had given my life meaning that simple survival could never provide. And meaning, I had learned, was worth any price. I am old now, nearing the end of my own journey. My body grows weaker with each passing year, though my mind remains sharp. Soon I will make my own passage to the afterlife, where I will face the judgment of Osiris and have my heart weighed against the feather of Mot. I do not fear that judgment. I have lived with honor, have served Egypt faithfully, have chosen courage over comfort when the moment demanded it. If my heart is light enough to pass the test, if I am declared true of voice and granted passage to the eternal fields, I will count my life as a success, a journey well traveled, a duty well performed. The younger servants sometimes ask me to tell them stories of the old days, of the conspiracy I helped expose, of the pharaohs I served. I tell them what I can, though I am careful to emphasize the lessons rather than glorify the drama. I tell them about the importance of observation, of listening not just to words, but to the silences between words. I tell them about loyalty and duty, about the responsibility that comes with being trusted with secrets. And I tell them about the moment of choice, that instant when we must decide who we are and what we stand for. But there are some things I do not tell them, some memories that remain too personal, too painful, or too sacred to share. I do not tell them about the nightmares I had for months after the assassination attempt, dreams where I failed to reach Prince Ramesses in time, where the iron blade found its mark and Egypt descended into chaos. I do not tell them about the guilt I sometimes felt, wondering if I could have acted sooner, if I could have done more to prevent the conspiracy from ever getting as far as it did. I do not tell them about the loneliness of my new role, the way my elevation had isolated me from the comfortable fellowship of other servants, making me something neither servant nor master, neither invisible nor fully visible. And I do not tell them about the times I wished I could return to my old life, to the simple rhythm of pouring wine and remaining unnoticed, to the safety of insignificance. Because there were such times, more often than I would like to admit, moments when the weight of responsibility felt crushing, when the knowledge of what I knew and what I had done seemed more burden than blessing. But those moments passed, as all moments do, and I remained at my post, serving Egypt in the way that fate and choice had determined for me. And gradually, over the years, I came to understand that my story was not really about me at all. It was about something larger, something that transcended my individual life and choices. It was about the thousands of invisible people who keep any great civilization functioning, the servants and workers and craftsmen whose names are never recorded, whose deeds are never celebrated, whose contributions are taken for granted until they are absent. It was about the fact that power and influence do not flow only from the top down, that even those at the bottom of the social hierarchy have agency and can make choices that matter. It was about the truth that in any system, no matter how hierarchical or rigid, there are always moments when individuals must decide between safety and conscience, between self-preservation and principle. And it was about the reality that such moments, when they come, do not announce themselves with trumpet fanfares or divine signs. They come quietly in ordinary rooms during ordinary conversations, and we must be prepared to recognize them and act accordingly. The palace where I have spent my entire life has seen so much history unfold within its walls. Great victories and crushing defeats, alliances forged and betrayals committed, births and deaths, joy and sorrow, the entire spectrum of human experience concentrated in this one place. The walls could tell countless stories, if walls could speak, stories of pharaohs and queens, of priests and generals, of conspiracies and celebrations. But they could also tell stories of people like me, of the servants who moved through these corridors carrying trays and jugs, of the workers who maintained the buildings and tended the gardens, of the scribes who recorded the daily business of governance, of all the unnamed individuals whose collective labor made possible the grandeur that visitors saw and admired. These are the stories that rarely get told, the lives that rarely get remembered, because history tends to focus on the powerful and prominent while treating everyone else as mere background. Yet it is these invisible people, I have learned, who ultimately determine whether any civilization thrives or fails. A kingdom can have the wisest pharaoh, the bravest generals, the most learned priests, but if the ordinary people who form the foundation of society are unhappy, oppressed, or disloyal, the entire structure will eventually collapse. The conspiracy that I helped expose was proof of this truth. Paynak and his fellow plotters nearly succeeded not because they were particularly clever or powerful, but because they had managed to recruit or corrupt people at every level of palace life, from guards to administrators to military officers. If enough of these ordinary functionaries had been willing to participate in or overlook the assassination, it would have succeeded regardless of what the pharaoh or Prince Ramesses wanted. The security of any regime, I came to understand, depends less on the loyalty of the elite than on the loyalty of the masses of ordinary people who could, if they chose, bring the whole system down through passive resistance or active betrayal. This is a truth that makes rulers uncomfortable when they think about it too carefully, which is perhaps why they prefer not to think about it at all. It is easier to believe that power flows from divine mandate or military might than to acknowledge its dependence on the continued cooperation of people who have every reason to be resentful or rebellious. But I saw this truth demonstrated over and over during my years of watching and listening. The palace functioned not because the pharaoh commanded it to function, but because thousands of individuals chose, day after day, to perform their duties with reasonable competence and loyalty. When that choice was withdrawn, when corruption spread and people began working for their own interests rather than the common good, the entire system began to break down. This was why the conspiracy had been so dangerous, not just because it threatened the Pharaoh's life, but because it represented a failure of the bonds that held society together. When high officials, like Paynak, could betray the trust placed in them, when guards could be bribed to ignore assassination attempts, when military officers could sell weapons to Egypt's enemies, it suggested that the social contract had broken down, that the ties of loyalty and duty that should have held everyone together had frayed to the point of uselessness. The restoration that followed the exposure of the conspiracy had been about more than just punishing the guilty. It had been about reaffirming those bonds, about reminding everyone of their obligations to something larger than themselves. The public trials, the executions, the stripping of honors and wealth from the conspirators and their families, all of this had served a purpose beyond simple justice. It had been a statement that betrayal would not be tolerated, that the divine order would be maintained, that the social contract remained in force. And it had worked, at least for a time. The years following Ramesses III's death had seen a renewed sense of unity and purpose in Egypt. The military had been reformed, the administration had been cleaned up, the temples had been reminded that their wealth and power came with responsibilities to the kingdom. People had been reminded of what they stood to lose if chaos were allowed to triumph over order. But I knew, watching from my position of privileged observation, that such restorations were always temporary. Each generation had to relearn the lessons of loyalty and duty for themselves. Each generation had to face its own conspiracies, its own betrayals, its own moments of choice between self-interest and common good. The specific details might change, but the underlying dynamics remained constant. This was both discouraging and hopeful. Discouraging, because it meant that the work of maintaining civilization was never finished, that vigilance could never be relaxed, that each victory against chaos was only temporary. But hopeful because it meant that each generation also had the opportunity to prove itself, to demonstrate its own commitment to the values and principles that held society together. I thought about these things often during my final years, as I trained the next generation of observers and watchers who would carry on the work after I was gone. I tried to pass on not just the practical skills of watching and listening, but also the deeper understanding of why such work mattered, of what was at stake, of the larger purposes that gave meaning to the mundane details of daily observation. Some of my students grasped these lessons quickly, showing the same combination of practical skill and moral understanding that I had eventually developed. Others struggled, seeing only the surface aspects of the work without understanding its deeper significance. And a few, I feared, were drawn to the role for the wrong reasons, attracted by the sense of power and influence it provided rather than by any genuine commitment to serving Egypt. I did what I could to guide them all, but I knew that ultimately each person would have to find their own way, would have to face their own moments of choice and prove themselves worthy or unworthy of the trust that had been placed in them. I could teach them skills and share my experience, but I could not give them integrity or courage. Those qualities had to come from within, from whatever combination of upbringing and character and circumstance shaped each individual's soul. The palace continued its eternal routines around me as I grew older and weaker. New pharaohs ascended the throne and passed away. New officials rose to power and fell from favor. New conspiracies emerged and were either thwarted or succeeded depending on the vigilance of those charged with detecting them. The great wheel of history kept turning, grinding forward through time, and I was just one small part of its mechanism, one tiny cog that had happened to be in the right place at the right moment to make a difference. I received visitors sometimes in my final years, people who had heard stories about the silent servant who had saved a pharaoh and wanted to meet me before I died. Some were genuinely curious about my story and what lessons it might hold. Others were seeking reflected glory, hoping to claim some connection to a historical event that had taken on mythic proportions in the retelling. And a few were scholars, priests, and scribes who wanted to record my story for posterity, to ensure that at least one account of these events survived in writing rather than just in oral tradition. To these scholars, I told what I could remember, though I warned them that memory is unreliable, that time and retelling inevitably distort events, that my version of the story was only one perspective among many possible perspectives. They wrote down my words anyway, transcribing them onto papyrus scrolls that would be stored in temple libraries, and perhaps read by people centuries, or even millennia in the future. The idea that my story might survive me, might be read by people living in times and places I could not imagine, was both humbling and strangely comforting. It suggested that my life had not been entirely insignificant, that my choice to speak rather than remain silent had consequences that extended beyond my own time. Even if those future readers could not fully understand the context of my decisions, even if the details of palace life and Egyptian politics meant nothing to them, perhaps they might still grasp the essential truth at the heart of my story, that courage matters, that individuals can make a difference, that silence in the face of evil is itself a form of evil. But I also warned the scribes not to make me into more than I was. I was not a hero in the traditional sense, not a warrior, or a king, or a prophet. I was simply a man who had happened to be in the right place to hear something important, and who had found the courage to act on what I heard. That was all. To transform me into some kind of legendary figure would be to miss the point entirely. The point was not that I was special or extraordinary. The point was precisely the opposite, that even someone as ordinary and insignificant as a wine-bearer could change history when circumstances demanded it. If my story was to have value for future generations, it would be as an example of how power can flow from unexpected sources, how the invisible and overlooked can suddenly become crucial, how no one is too small to make a difference when the moment calls for action. There were nights, in those final years, when I would lie in my comfortable chamber and think about the moment in Paynak's quarters when I had first heard the conspiracy discussed. I would replay the scene in my mind, remembering the lamplight and the shadows, the voices of the conspirators, the weight of the wine jug in my hands, the terrible understanding that had slowly dawned as I realized what I was hearing. And I would wonder what would have happened if I had made a different choice. What if I had remained silent, had convinced myself that I had misunderstood or that it was not my place to interfere? The assassination would have succeeded. Ramesses III would have died in the Eastern Gardens at dawn, struck down by an iron blade. Prince Pentuer would have seized power, probably plunging Egypt into civil war as Prince Ramesses and his supporters contested the succession. Thousands would have died in the fighting. The kingdom would have been weakened, making it vulnerable to foreign invasion. The temples would have been drawn into the conflict, forced to choose sides, and potentially fragmenting the religious unity that had always been one of Egypt's greatest strengths. All of that chaos and suffering would have flowed from my silence, from my decision to remain invisible and uninvolved. The weight of that alternative history, even though it had never actually happened, still felt heavy sometimes. It reminded me of how much can depend on small choices made by ordinary people, of how the course of history often hinges on moments that seem insignificant at the time. But I had not remained silent. I had chosen to speak, to act, to risk everything for what I knew was right. And that choice had led to everything that followed: the exposure of the conspiracy, the saving of the Pharaoh's life, my transformation from invisible servant to visible guardian, the years of service in my new role, the training of others to carry on the work, and eventually this final period of reflection as I prepared to leave this world for whatever came next. Had it been the right choice? Yes, I believed it had been, despite all the costs and complications. Would I make the same choice again if I could return to that moment? Yes, without hesitation. Not because I was brave or noble, but because I had discovered through experience that some choices are unavoidable, that some moments demand action regardless of the consequences, that there are times when remaining invisible is simply not an option for anyone who wants to be able to live with themselves. The priests who visited me in my final illness told me that I had earned a place in the blessed afterlife, that my service to Egypt and the Pharaoh would weigh in my favor when my heart was judged against the feather of Mut. I wanted to believe them, but I also knew that the judgment of the gods was beyond human prediction or control. I could only hope that I had lived with sufficient integrity and purpose to pass the test that awaited every soul after death. I thought about my father often during this time, wondering what he would have made of my life and choices. He had taught me to be invisible, to serve without being noticed, to survive through silence and discretion. And I had spent most of my life following those teachings faithfully. But in the moment of crisis, I had violated everything he had taught me, had made myself visible and spoken when I should have remained silent. Would he have been proud or disappointed? Grateful that I had saved the Pharaoh, or horrified that I had taken such risks? I would never know, because he had died many years before the conspiracy, had never seen me become anything more than the simple wine-bearer he had trained me to be. But I like to think that he would have understood, that he would have recognized the necessity of my choice even if it contradicted his teachings. After all, he had taught me those survival skills not as ends in themselves, but as means to an end. He had wanted me to survive and thrive in the dangerous environment of the palace. And I had survived, had more than survived, had found a way to turn my training into something meaningful and valuable. Perhaps that was his real legacy, not the specific skills and strategies he had taught me, but the underlying principle that adaptation and intelligence were the keys to survival. He had adapted to his circumstances by becoming invisible. I had adapted to mine by learning when to become visible. Both strategies had served their purposes in their proper contexts. The Pharaoh who ruled during my final years, Ramesses V, was a decent man though not a great one. He lacked his grandfather's political skill and his father's administrative competence, but he was conscientious and well-meaning, and Egypt continued to function adequately under his rule. The kingdom was not expanding or gaining new glory, but neither was it collapsing or being conquered. For most ordinary Egyptians, life continued much as it always had, with the eternal rhythms of planting and harvest, flood and dry season, birth and death marking the passage of time more reliably than the names of the pharaohs who came and went. I watched this pharaoh with the same careful attention I had given his predecessors, noting his strengths and weaknesses, identifying potential threats to his reign, advising when asked and sometimes when not asked. But I knew my time was ending, that soon I would no longer be able to serve, that the work would pass to others who had learned from me, but would inevitably develop their own methods and approaches. This was as it should be. Every generation must find its own way, must face its own challenges with whatever wisdom and courage it can muster. I had done what I could to prepare the next generation of watchers and guardians, but I could not control how they would use what I had taught them, or what choices they would make when their own moments of crisis came. I could only trust that the principles I had tried to embody and teach, principles of loyalty and duty and courage and integrity, would survive my death and continue to guide those who came after me. These principles were not unique to me or original with me. They were as old as Egyptian civilization itself, woven into the concept of Ma'at that had sustained our kingdom for thousands of years. My contribution, if I had made one, was simply to demonstrate that these principles applied to everyone, from the highest pharaoh to the lowest servant, and that living by them could give meaning and purpose to even the most humble life. The end, when it came, was peaceful. I died in my sleep one night, slipping away from this world so gently that I did not even wake to notice my passing. The priest said later that this was a sign of divine favor, that the gods had granted me an easy death in recognition of my faithful service. Whether this was true or simply the comfort that priests traditionally offered to the bereaved, I could not say. But I hoped it was true, hoped that my heart would prove light enough to pass the judgment, hoped that I would be declared true of voice and granted passage to the eternal fields where I might finally rest after a lifetime of watchfulness. My funeral was modest by the standards of palace officials, but more elaborate than any ordinary servant could have expected. The new Pharaoh, honoring the promises made by his predecessors, ensured that I was given a proper burial in a small tomb cut into the cliffs near the Valley of the Kings. Not in the valley itself, which was reserved for royalty, but near enough to be associated with that sacred necropolis, near enough to suggest that I had been someone of importance, someone whose service had been valued. The tomb was decorated with scenes of me performing my duties, pouring wine for pharaohs, standing in the shadows of great councils, watching over Egypt with vigilant eyes. There were also texts, prayers and spells to guide me through the afterlife, declarations of innocence to be recited before the 42 judges, hymns to Osiris and Ra and the other gods, who would determine my eternal fate. And there was one scene, painted prominently on the wall of the burial chamber, that showed me standing before the Pharaoh Ramesses III, receiving his thanks and blessing for saving his life. This was the scene I would want anyone who entered my tomb to see and remember. Not because it glorified me or made me seem more important than I was, but because it testified to a truth that I believed was worth preserving, that service matters, that loyalty has value, that courage can be found in unexpected places, that even the invisible can change history. The tomb was sealed after my burial, closing me in the darkness that would be my home for eternity, or at least until grave robbers or archaeologists broke through the seal in some distant future. My body was mummified and placed in a wooden coffin, surrounded by the modest gray goods that I would supposedly need in the afterlife: food and drink, clothing, a few personal possessions, and the shabby figures that would serve me in the fields of paradise, performing the labor that even the blessed dead were expected to do. And there I would remain, preserved in the desert sand and stone, a silent witness to the age in which I had lived and the choices I had made. Future generations might discover my tomb and wonder who I had been, what I had done to merit such burial. The paintings and texts would tell them something of my story, but they could not convey the lived experience of it, the fear and courage, the doubt and determination, the lonely choices made in the darkness of uncertain nights. But perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it was enough that my story was preserved at all, that some record remained of a life that otherwise would have been completely forgotten. Perhaps it was enough that future visitors to my tomb might pause and reflect on what it meant to be a servant who changed history, an invisible man who chose visibility when the moment demanded it, an ordinary person who found extraordinary courage when Egypt needed it most. The story of the Pharaoh's silent servant ends here, in a modest tomb cut into the cliffs of Thebes, surrounded by the paintings and texts that preserve my memory for whatever future might come. The wine-bearer who heard treason, who chose courage over safety, who saved a pharaoh and served Egypt with everything he had, has passed into the next world, leaving behind only this record of a life well lived and duties faithfully performed. But the principles that guided my life, the values that sustained me through my years of service, these remain eternal. They do not depend on me or any individual to keep them alive. They are woven into the fabric of civilization itself, renewed with each generation that chooses duty over ease, courage over fear, principle over profit, service over selfishness. As long as there are people willing to stand up for what is right even when it is dangerous, as long as there are individuals who understand that silence in the face of evil is itself a form of evil, as long as there are those who recognize that power and privilege come with responsibilities to those who have less, then the essential truth of my story will remain alive and relevant. This is my legacy. Not the tomb or the paintings or the gratitude of pharaohs, but the simple truth that every individual matters, that every choice has consequences, that no one is too small or insignificant to change the world when the moment calls for action. May those who hear my story in future ages, whether they be Egyptians or foreigners, servants or rulers, remember this truth and live by it. May they find in themselves the courage to speak when silence would be easier, to act when passivity would be safer, to stand for justice even when injustice seems overwhelming. And may Egypt endure forever, sustained by the loyalty and courage of its people, guided by the principles of Ma'at, protected by the gods, and by the countless unnamed individuals who choose every day to serve something greater than themselves. This is my prayer, my hope, my final testament. May it be heard and remembered, may it inspire and guide, may it remind all who come after that even in the darkest moments, even when chaos seems ready to triumph over order, there is always hope as long as individuals of courage and conscience refuse to remain silent. The sun sets now on my life and on this story, as it sets every evening over the western cliffs of Thebes, promising with its descent to rise again tomorrow in eternal renewal. The river flows on, the seasons turn, the great wheel of history continues its revolution. And somewhere in the palace, a servant pours wine, watches, listens, and prepares for their own moment of choice, their own opportunity to prove that the invisible are never truly powerless, that the silent can speak truth to power, that even the least of us can be the greatest when circumstances demand it. This is the end of my story, but it is not the end of the story. For as long as civilizations rise and fall, as long as power corrupts and virtue struggles against vice, as long as individuals face moments of choice between safety and conscience, this story will continue, enacted by different people in different times, but always expressing the same eternal truths about courage, duty, loyalty, and the power of individuals to shape history. Sleep well now, dear listener, and may your own choices be guided by wisdom and courage. May you find in yourself the strength to act when action is needed, to speak when speech is required, to stand for what is right regardless of the personal cost. And may you remember, when your own moment of choice comes, that you are never as powerless as you might feel, that even the smallest voice can echo through history, that even the most invisible person can cast a shadow that shapes the world. Good night, and may the gods of Egypt, or whatever powers you hold sacred, watch over you and guide you through all the days and nights of your life. May you walk in beauty, may you live with integrity, may you find meaning and purpose in your journey through this world. And may you remember always that your choices matter, that your life has significance, that you have within you the same potential for courage and service that allowed one silent servant to save a pharaoh and change the course of history. The story ends. The wine-bearer rests. But the legacy endures, eternal as the pyramids, constant as the Nile, unchanging as the stars that wheel overhead through the endless Egyptian nights. Remember this. Remember me. Remember that even you, wherever and whoever you are, have within you the power to change the world. You need only find the courage to use it when the moment comes. And the moment always comes, for everyone, eventually. How you respond to it will define who you are and what your life means. Choose wisely, act courageously, and may your heart be light when it is finally weighed against the feather of truth. Farewell.